There is a mountain in northwestern Saudi Arabia, surrounded by barbed wire and watched by military patrols. Signs in Arabic warn, "Restricted area." Anyone who tries to approach is detained, interrogated, and deported. The name of the place is Jebel al-Lawz, and a growing number of researchers believe that the true Mount Sinai stands right there. The official history you probably learned mentions the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt, the monastery of St. Catherine, Jebel Musa, where tourists climb before dawn to watch the sunrise. For 1,600 years, pilgrims traveled there believing they were stepping on the sacred ground where Moses received the 10 Commandments. But what if they had been in the wrong place all along? The theory that Mount Sinai is located in Saudi Arabia is not new. It appears in texts from the 1st century. The Apostle Paul, writing to the Galatians, makes a statement that went unnoticed for centuries. Galatians chapter 4, verse 25. Hagar stands for Mount Sinai in Arabia, not in Egypt. Paul, a man who deeply understood the geography of the ancient world, who traveled thousands of kilometers across the Mediterranean, who studied at the feet of Gamaliel in Jerusalem, places Sinai within the borders of Arabia, not as metaphor, as literal geographic location. But for centuries this reference was ignored or reinterpreted. Theologians argued that Paul used Arabia in a broad sense, including the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula. Others said it was figurative language. Tradition was already established. Saint Helena had pointed to Jebel Musa in the 4th century. The monastery of St. Catherine had existed since the 6th century. Millions of pilgrims had already made the journey. Questioning the location seemed unnecessary. And there was an even greater practical problem. Modern Saudi Arabia is one of the most closed countries on the planet for Western archaeological research. For decades, it was simply not possible to verify what existed in that territory. Visas were denied, permits were refused. The northwestern region of the kingdom remained inaccessible for any independent investigation, until 2 Americans decided to ignore the rules. In 1984, Larry Williams and Bob Cornuke illegally crossed the Saudi border coming from Jordan. They were not professional archaeologists. Williams was a commodities investor who had made a fortune in the futures market. Cornuke was a former police officer and former security agent who had become an amateur biblical investigator. Together they formed an unlikely duo for a clandestine archaeological expedition. But they carried cameras, detailed maps, desert survival equipment, and a theory they wanted to test personally. They had studied Paul's references. They had analyzed ancient maps of the Midian region. They had calculated alternative routes for the Exodus that did not pass through patrolled Egyptian territory. Everything pointed to a specific mountain. The target was Jebel al-Lawz, which means Mountain of Almonds in Arabic, a granite formation with 2,580 meters of altitude, located approximately 70 kilometers from the coast of the Gulf of Aqaba. It sits in the region historically known as Midian, exactly where the Bible says Moses spent 40 years herding sheep before encountering the burning bush. Consider the geography for a moment. When Moses fled Egypt after killing an Egyptian, Exodus chapter 2 is specific about his destination. He went to Midian, not to the Egyptian Sinai desert. Midian. There he met Jethro, priest of the region. He married Zipporah, Jethro's daughter. He worked as a shepherd for 4 decades, learning every valley, every water source, every safe route of that territory. And it was in Midian, not in Egypt, that God appeared in the burning bush and commanded Moses to return to free Israel. Exodus chapter 3, verse 1 says that Moses led the flock beyond the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. If Moses was in Midian working as a shepherd, and Midian is in northwestern Arabia, the mountain of God should also be there. The geographic logic is straightforward. The only problem was that no one could verify it. Williams and Cornick arrived at Jebel al-Lawz during the night to avoid patrols. They crossed the desert with flashlights off, guiding themselves by primitive GPS and compass. The risk was real. Saudi Arabia does not treat intruders kindly, especially Americans photographing installations in sensitive areas. Espionage would be the most likely charge, but when the sun rose and they saw the mountain for the first time, the risk seemed worth it. What they found in the following hours defied any casual explanation. The top of the mountain was black, not dark from shadow or vegetation, black as if it had been carbonized by extreme heat. Granite rocks that normally display grayish, pinkish or reddish coloration were covered by a blackened layer that extended across the entire upper portion of the peak. The demarcation line was visible. Below a certain altitude, normal rock. Above, intense carbonization. Exodus chapter 19 describes Mount Sinai when God descended upon it. Verse 18, Mount Sinai was covered with smoke because the Lord descended on it in fire. The smoke billowed up from it like smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently. The appearance described is of volcanic activity, fire, smoke, trembling. But Jebel al-Lawz is not volcanic. There is no record of igneous geological activity in that region for millions of years. No active or extinct volcano nearby. No obvious natural explanation for that carbonization. At the base of the mountain, Williams and Cornick found something even more disturbing. A large altar built with stacked stones, not cut. Exodus chapter 20, verses 24 and 25, contains a specific instruction from God. Make an altar of stones for me. Do not build it with dressed stones, for you will defile it if you use a tool on it. Raw stones. Unworked. Exactly what was there? But the most shocking detail was on the surface of that altar. Engravings, primitive drawings of cattle, rough representations of calves scratched into the stone. If that was Mount Sinai, that altar would be consistent with the place where Israel committed its first great apostasy. Exodus chapter 32 recounts the episode. While Moses remained at the top of the mountain for 40 days, receiving the tablets of the law, the people grew impatient. They pressured Aaron to make a visible God. Aaron collected the gold earrings from the people, melted everything, and molded a golden calf. He built an altar before the image, and the people offered sacrifices, ate, drank, and rose up to dance. When Moses came down and saw the scene, he broke the tablets of the law and burned the calf until it turned to dust. The altar with calf engravings at the base of Jebel al-Lawz would be physical evidence of that event. Not definitive proof, but disturbing consistency. Nearby, the explorers found 12 stone pillars organized in a semicircle. Vertical structures clearly built, not natural formations. Exodus chapter 24 verse 4 records that Moses erected 12 columns representing the 12 tribes of Israel at the base of the mountain as part of the covenant ratification ceremony. The pillars were there, deteriorated by more than 3,000 years of exposure to the desert climate, but still recognizable as intentional human constructions. There was also a large split rock with water erosion marks running down its sides, deep grooves descending along the stone surface as if large volumes of water had repeatedly flowed from there. In the middle of a desert where average annual precipitation barely reaches 50 millimeters, where heavy rains are rare events separated by years. Exodus chapter 17 describes a moment of crisis. The people were dying of thirst in the desert. They complained against Moses. God commanded Moses to strike a specific rock at Horeb. Moses obeyed. Water gushed from the stone in quantity sufficient to satisfy 2 million people and all their flocks. If that was coincidence, it was an extraordinarily specific coincidence. a split rock with intense water flow marks in one of the driest places on the planet. Williams and Cornuke photographed everything, dozens of images documenting each anomaly, the carbonized top seen from various angles, the altar with the calf engravings in close-up, the 12 pillars measured and recorded, the split rock with its inexplicable grooves, visual evidence that could be analyzed by specialists, but they did not have time to explore further. Saudi patrols located them on the second morning. They were surrounded by military vehicles, detained at gunpoint with automatic weapons, taken for interrogation at a nearby base, accused of border violation and potential espionage. They spent 78 hours detained, repetitive interrogations, questions about government affiliations, expedition funding, contacts in the region. All photographic equipment was confiscated, cameras, film, notes. Everything that could document what they had seen was taken. Eventually, they were deported through Jordan with a severe warning never to return. The original images were never recovered, lost in the files of some Saudi security agency, or destroyed. Williams and Cornuke returned to the United States only with memories and hand-drawn sketches made after deportation. But something changed at Jebel al-Lawz after the expedition. Months later, reports began to circulate. The mountain had been fenced. Military-grade barbed wire surrounded the entire base in a perimeter of several kilometers. Surveillance posts were installed at strategic points. Prohibition signs appeared in Arabic and English. The area was officially designated as a restricted military zone, access completely forbidden for civilians, foreigners, and even Saudi citizens without special authorization. Why does a government fence off a mountain in the middle of the desert? Saudi Arabia has thousands of rock formations scattered across its territory, mountains, valleys, canyons. The vast majority have no fence, no surveillance, no access restriction. Bedouins transit freely through the desert. Tourists visit Nabatean sites like Madain Saleh. The region is not particularly sensitive from a military standpoint. There are no bases, nuclear facilities, or known strategic resources near Jebel al-Lawz. The official response never came. The Saudi government issued no statement explaining the decision. No national security reason was presented. No archaeological, environmental, or administrative justification. Only institutional silence and physical barbed wire. The story did not end. With Williams and Cornuke, in the 1990s, commercial satellite images began to reveal what the fences were trying to hide. High-resolution photographs obtained by private companies clearly showed the blackened top of Jebel al-Lawz. The dark coloration of the peak contrasted dramatically with the surrounding rocks. It was not an illusion of shadow or sun angle. It was a real difference in tonality captured in multiple satellite passes at different times and seasons. The images also showed structures at the base that did not appear to be natural formations. Arrangements of stones in geometric patterns, what appeared to be an ancient demarcation system at the lower perimeter. Evidence visible from space that something had been built there by human hands. In 1992, researcher Ron Wyatt gained partial access to the region through unconventional diplomatic contacts. Wyatt was a controversial figure in biblical archaeology. He claimed to have found Noah's Ark on Mount Ararat, the site of the Red Sea crossing in the Gulf of Aqaba, and various other biblical sites. Many academics considered him a sensationalist who saw biblical confirmations where none existed. His methodologies were questioned, his academic credentials were non-existent. But what Wyatt documented at Jebel al-Lawz did not depend on subjective interpretation. They were visible, photographable, measurable physical structures. Wyatt managed to photograph the altar with the calf engravings. The images clearly showed bovine representations scratched into the stone, some more elaborate than others, some partially eroded by time. He photographed the stone pillars at the base, 12 vertical structures that he measured and documented individually. He photographed the split rock with its water erosion grooves, including close-ups of the flow marks. He photographed the carbonized peak seen from different distances, showing the transition line between normal rock and blackened rock. And he photographed something the previous explorers had not adequately documented: a cave on the eastern flank of the mountain at approximately 2/3 of the total ascent altitude, a natural opening in the rock large enough to shelter a person. Exodus chapter 33, verses 21 and 22 describes an extraordinary moment. God says to Moses, "There is a place near me where you may stand on a rock. When my glory passes by, I will put you in a cleft in the rock and cover you with my hand until I have passed by." A cleft in the rock, a divine hiding place where Moses was protected while God's glory passed. 1 Kings chapter 19 records another visit to that same place. Centuries after Moses, the prophet Elijah fled from Queen Jezebel for 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. Verse 9, there he went into a cave and spent the night. In the same cave? Jewish tradition says yes. The same cleft in the rock where Moses hid served as shelter for Elijah generations later. The cave at Jebel al-Lawz is positioned exactly where it would be if it were that place, high enough to be separated from the plain where the people camped, accessible but not easy to reach, protected from the elements, large enough for shelter, small enough for hiding. Wyatt was also eventually forced to leave the country. His circumstances of departure were never fully clarified, but his photographs circulated. Independent documentaries were produced using his material. Books were written analyzing the evidence, and an uncomfortable question began to gain traction in increasingly wider circles. If there is nothing special about that mountain, why so much effort to prevent people from investigating it? The traditional location of Sinai in Egypt has its own problems that are rarely discussed. Jebel Musa, considered the most popular candidate for Mount Sinai, was identified as such only in the 4th century after Christ. The identification came from Empress Helena, mother of Emperor Constantine. Helena traveled to the east in 326 after Christ on a pilgrimage to identify and preserve sacred sites of Christianity. She was already over 70 years old. She made decisions based on dreams, visions, reports from local residents, and pious intuition. In Jerusalem, Helena identified the site of the crucifixion and burial of Jesus. In Bethlehem, she identified the grotto of the Nativity. And in the Sinai Peninsula, she identified the mountain where Moses received the law. There was no archaeological excavation. There was no analysis of physical evidence. There was no comparison with other possible locations. Helena pointed and said, "It is here," and Christian tradition accepted. The monastery of St. Catherine was built at that location by order of Emperor Justinian between 548 and 565 after Christ. The complex was erected around what tradition said was the site of the burning bush. Orthodox monks have maintained the monastery continuously since then. Millions of pilgrims visited the place. Over the centuries, tradition solidified, but no concrete archaeological evidence links Jebel Musa to the biblical account. No ancient altar was found at the base. No stone pillar. No structure consistent with a camp of millions of people for almost a year. No artifact dated from the Exodus period. Only medieval tradition built on a 4th century identification based on visions of an elderly empress. Even more problematic is the implied geographic route. If Mount Sinai is in the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula, Israel would have had to cross territory controlled by Egyptian garrisons throughout the entire journey after crossing the Red Sea. Pharaonic Egypt maintained rigid control over the Sinai Peninsula. There were military fortresses protecting strategic routes. Turquoise and copper mines employed forced laborers under armed supervision. the so-called Via Maris, was constantly patrolled by Egyptian detachments. How would a fugitive people of approximately 2 million, with women, children, elderly, flocks and carts loaded with Egyptian spoils, pass unnoticed through enemy territory for months? Pharaoh had just lost his slave workforce. He was furious. He pursued Israel to the sea. Is it plausible that there would be no sighting report from Egyptian garrisons on the peninsula during a journey of almost a year? The alternative route through Arabia solves these geographic problems. Israel crosses the Red Sea at the Gulf of Aqaba, the eastern extension of the sea between the Sinai Peninsula and Arabia. The crossing would have occurred at a narrow point where the depth allows passage with the waters divided. After crossing, they disembark on the northwestern coast of Arabia, outside Egyptian territory. They travel through the desert of Midian, a region Moses knew intimately from having lived there for 40 years. He knew where there was water. He knew which routes were safe. He knew how to survive in that specific terrain. It was not unknown territory for the leader. It was his second home. They arrive at Jebel al-Lawz after approximately 45 days of travel, consistent with the Exodus account that places arrival at Sinai in the 3rd month after leaving Egypt. The total distance is compatible, the travel time is compatible, and there were no Egyptian garrisons along the way. There is yet another piece of evidence frequently ignored in academic debates. Flavius Josephus, Jewish historian of the 1st century after Christ, had privileged access to historical records from the temple in Jerusalem. His work, Jewish Antiquities, contains the assertion that Mount Sinai was the highest peak in the region where it was located. Jebel Musa in Egypt has 2,285 meters of altitude. Impressive, but it is not the highest peak of the Sinai Peninsula. Jebel Katarina, just 2 kilometers to the south, has 2,641 meters. If Josephus was correct, Jebel Musa cannot be Sinai. Jebel al-Lawz, with 2,580 meters, is the highest peak in all of northwestern Saudi Arabia. It visually dominates the horizon for dozens of kilometers in all directions, consistent with Josephus's description. Josephus also wrote that the area around the mountain was used for grazing because it had vegetation suitable for flocks. The Jebel al-Lawz region still today has denser vegetation than the immediate desert surroundings, fed by underground aquifers that surface in periodic springs. Bedouins use the area for grazing to this day. The region around Jebel Musa in Egypt is predominantly bare rock with extremely sparse vegetation. But perhaps the most intriguing evidence of all is the one that remains inaccessible for verification. Saudi Arabia not only fenced Jebel al-Lawz, it also restricted low-altitude flyovers. Drone operators in the vicinity were detained and had equipment confiscated. Researchers who tried to access the region with formal academic authorization were systematically denied. 3 American universities, 2 British and 1 German, had research permit requests rejected without justification between 1995 and 2015. A British archaeologist from Cambridge University, who requested permission to study the area, received a formal rejection from the Saudi Ministry of Antiquities. No explanation. 3 different documentary teams had entry visas denied when they mentioned Jebel al-Lawz as a filming destination. A BBC team that tried to obtain aerial footage of the region for a documentary about the Exodus had their flight plan rejected by Saudi civil aviation authorities. What exactly justifies this level of protection for a rock formation in the desert? Several theories circulate among researchers and observers. The first is religious sensitivity on a geopolitical scale. If Jebel al-Lawz were confirmed as the true Mount Sinai through systematic archaeological excavations, it would automatically become the most sacred site in Judaism and one of the most important locations in Christianity, all within Saudi territory. This would create massive international pressure for access. Jewish and Christian pilgrims would demand visitation rights. Religious organizations would push for construction of visitor infrastructure. Western governments could link diplomatic relations to access guarantees. In extreme scenarios, groups could make quasi-territorial claims over the sacred site. For a kingdom that already guards Mecca and Medina with absolute rigor, allowing only Muslims in the sacred cities of Islam, adding a third sacred site from different religions to its territory would be diplomatically complicated beyond measure. Easier to keep it fenced and confirm nothing. The second theory is more pragmatic and connected to recent developments. The Midian region, where Jebel al-Lawz is located, is being developed as part of the Neom project. That is the futuristic megacity of $500 billion that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman announced as the centerpiece of his vision to transform the Saudi economy beyond oil. Neom plans to occupy 26,500 square kilometers in northwestern Arabia, exactly in the region where Jebel al-Lawz is located. The project includes linear cities, luxury resorts, technology, and entertainment centers. Construction on a massive scale. If there are significant archaeological sites in the development area, they could delay or complicate construction. International laws and pressure from heritage preservation organizations could force changes to the plans. Investors could get nervous. Timelines could be compromised. Easier not to investigate and not confirm anything. The third theory speculates that the Saudi government may have conducted its own excavations in secret. Perhaps they found exactly what Williams, Cornuke and Wyatt reported. Perhaps they found even more: artifacts, inscriptions, evidence that would definitively confirm the identification. But Saudi Arabia does not have the institutional infrastructure to deal with the consequences of such confirmation. It has no tradition of managing sacred sites of other religions. It has no experience with mass non-Muslim religious tourism. Confirming that Mount Sinai is in Arabia would rewrite history books, world tourism maps, pilgrimage routes established for centuries. Sometimes institutional silence is easier to manage than complicated truths. And there is a fourth possibility that defenders of the traditional Egyptian location raise. Perhaps there is nothing significant at Jebel al-Lawz. Perhaps the blackened rocks are the result of some unidentified natural phenomenon, electrical discharge from storms or unusual mineral oxidation. Perhaps the pillars are geological formations that only appear to be built. Perhaps the altar is relatively recent Bedouin construction. Perhaps the fence exists simply because it is sensitive border territory near Jordan and Israel, and Saudi authorities are naturally paranoid about foreigners photographing anything in the region. But if there is nothing there, why not allow independent and qualified researchers to verify and close the debate once and for all? An international archaeological team with Saudi supervision could examine the site in weeks. Samples from the blackened rocks could be analyzed in a laboratory. The age of the structures could be estimated by established dating methods. The mystery could be resolved for or against the theory. The continued silence only feeds speculation. The mystery persists precisely because no one can gain access to resolve it. It is a perfect archaeological impasse. Sufficient circumstantial evidence to raise serious questions, but insufficient access to answer them definitively. In 2018, the Saudi government announced plans to develop historical tourism in the al-Bad region, a city located approximately 30 kilometers from Jebel al-Lawz. For the first time, Saudi authorities officially recognized that the area has connection to biblical narratives. They mentioned historical sites related to Moses and Jethro. Tourist signs were installed identifying wells of Moses and caves of Jethro as attractions. But Jebel al-Lawz itself remained fenced. Tourists can visit al-Bad. They can see the wells where tradition says Moses met Jethro's daughters. They can photograph caves where supposedly Moses' father-in-law lived. They cannot approach the mountain. They cannot climb. They cannot examine the evidence that really matters. Satellite images from 2020 obtained by commercial services show that the fences around Jebel al-Lawz have been reinforced. The original barbed wire barrier was replaced or supplemented by more robust structures in several stretches. New surveillance buildings appeared on the northeastern perimeter. Access through the southern face, which historically was the least monitored and through which some clandestine visitors had managed to approach, now has continuous physical barrier. If the goal was to reduce international interest in the mountain, the effect was precisely opposite. Each additional fence, each expanded restriction, each denied permit feeds speculation that something significant is being deliberately hidden. Think about the magnitude of what is potentially at stake. Mount Sinai is not a minor location in the biblical narrative. It is perhaps the most important site in the Old Testament after the Garden of Eden. It is where God revealed himself collectively and spectacularly to an entire nation. Exodus chapter 19 describes the scene. Approximately 2 million people camped on the plain around the mountain. Thunder rumbling, lightning cutting across the sky, a thick cloud covering the peak. The sound of a trumpet that continually increased in volume and intensity, fire visible at the top, smoke rising like from a furnace, the entire mountain trembling, and the voice of God thundering words that would be engraved in stone. It is where the 10 Commandments were delivered. 10 sentences that founded legal systems, moral codes, and ethical structures of the entire Western world for more than 3 millennia. You shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not bear false witness. Principles that still define criminal law, professional ethics, and individual conscience today. It is where the covenant between God and Israel was formally ratified with the blood of sacrifices, where the tablets of the law were written by the divine finger itself, where Moses spent 40 days in God's presence without eating or drinking, where the design of the tabernacle was revealed, where the priesthood was instituted. If you could locate that mountain with archaeological certainty, you would have identified the most significant site in world religious history, a place that 3 monotheistic religions consider sacred, a physical landmark that billions of people revere through the texts that describe what happened there. And that place may be surrounded by barbed wire in northwestern Saudi Arabia. Academic critics argue that the Jebel al-Lawz theory is popular sensationalism without rigorous scientific basis. They point out that Ron Wyatt made unproven claims about multiple discoveries throughout his life, none confirmed by conventional academic archaeology. They point out that Williams and Cornuke were not trained professionals and may have misinterpreted what they saw. They point out that no archaeologist with full academic credentials and established reputation has publicly endorsed the theory with their professional name at stake. All of this is true. The Jebel al-Lawz theory remains in the territory of unproven hypothesis, not established fact. But it is also true that no academic archaeologist has gained access to the site to conduct systematic investigation that could refute the theory. Saudi Arabia has not published any study of its own about the mountain. It has not invited neutral international teams to examine the evidence. It has not opened the doors for research that could close the controversy definitively, either confirming or denying the identification. Instead of transparency, it increased security. Instead of investigation, it imposed silence. Instead of evidence, it maintained fences. Physical evidence does not disappear because it is fenced. The carbonization of the top of Jebel al-Lawz is documented in dozens of satellite images from multiple sources over decades. The geographic coordinates are public. Anyone with access to Google Earth can locate the mountain and observe the dark coloration of the peak contrasting dramatically with all the surrounding geology. What that person cannot do is get close enough to collect rock samples, cannot perform chemical analysis of the carbonization, cannot conduct carbon dating of organic material at the site, cannot systematically excavate the base to verify whether the structures are ancient or recent, cannot examine the altar engravings with proper equipment, cannot do anything but look from afar and speculate. Meanwhile, the monastery of St. Catherine in Egypt continues to receive tens of thousands of visitors per year. Pilgrims from all over the world climb the 3,750 steps of Jebel Musa before dawn. They watch the sunrise over the Sinai desert. They descend exhausted but spiritually satisfied, believing they have stepped exactly where Moses stepped more than 3,000 years ago. Perhaps they are right. The tradition of 1,600 years carries significant historical weight. Generations of saints, scholars, and pilgrims accepted that identification. The monastery of St. Catherine preserves ancient manuscripts and precious icons. The place has sanctity accumulated through centuries of prayer and devotion, regardless of its original geographic accuracy. Or perhaps millions of people over 16 centuries climbed the wrong mountain. Perhaps the true Sinai is 1,000 kilometers away, surrounded by barbed wire, guarded by Saudi soldiers, inaccessible for verification. The geopolitical irony of this possibility does not go unnoticed. One of the most formative events in Western religious tradition, the delivery of divine law that shaped entire civilizations, may have occurred in territory that today belongs to an Islamic nation that does not share that tradition and that apparently prefers the world not to investigate too closely. There is no way to resolve this question with certainty until the fences fall, until systematic archaeological excavations are authorized by qualified teams with rigorous methodology, until samples are collected, analyzed in independent laboratories, and results published in peer-reviewed scientific journals, until evidence replaces speculation and fact replaces theory. Until then, everything remains in the epistemologically uncomfortable territory between intriguing hypothesis and demonstrated truth, between extraordinary coincidence and archaeological confirmation, between accumulated circumstantial evidence and absent definitive proof. No official excavation has been authorized. No archaeological study published with unrestricted access to the site. No formal declaration from the Saudi government about what exists within that fenced perimeter. Only satellite images captured from space remain, first-hand accounts from those who managed to approach before the complete blockade, smuggled photographs that have circulated for decades, and a list of coincidences difficult to ignore or explain casually. Carbonized summit without volcanic activity, altar of raw stones with calf engravings, 12 columns, aligned at the base, cave on the eastern flank at the correct altitude, split rock with water erosion marks in a desert where it practically never rains. Saudi Arabia may have its legitimate reasons. National security in a sensitive border region, territorial control over future resources, religious sensitivity about sacred sites of other traditions, concerns about the Neom project, or something that has not yet been publicly articulated. Meanwhile, the mountain remains there, silent under the desert sun, forbidden for any unauthorized approach, and inexplicably guarded as if it hid something the world should not see.